I never thought a quiet life by the lake would turn into a battle of power, greed, and revenge. But that's exactly what happened the day the HOA decided to put up a fence around my only lake entrance. See, I live in a small lakeside community. Beautiful plays, calm mornings, fishermen casting their lines, kids splashing near the dock in the summers. For years, I had direct access to the lake from a little dirt path that cut through a strip of land. That path was my lifeline. I could launch my boat, take a swim, or just sit by the water with a cup of coffee. But one morning, everything changed. I walked down with my fishing pole, humming the same tune I always did when I stopped dead in my tracks. A brand new chain-link fence, tall and ugly, stood where my entrance used to be. On it, a shiny metal sign, HOA property, nitrogen monoxide, trespassing. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe construction. Maybe safety reasons. I called the HOA president, a man named Charles Whitman Smug. Self-important guy who always wore golf polos, even when he wasn't golfing. "Charles," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "what's going on with the fence by my lake access?" There was a pause on the line, and then he chuckled. "Oh, that? Well, the HOA board decided to restrict lake access. Liability issues, insurance, you know how it goes. Only approved members can use the gated entrance now. We'll be distributing keys eventually." Eventually? I pressed. I live right there. That path is how I've always accessed the lake. Another chuckle. "Well, rules are rules, my friend. If you'd like quicker access, you can apply for a special lakes use permit. The fee is $3,000 per year." I nearly dropped the phone. $3,000. To use the lake I've been accessing for free on my own property. "That's how it works now," Charles said smugly. "Welcome to community living." That was the moment I knew I wasn't just dealing with bureaucracy. This wasn't about safety or insurance. It was about control. About power. And Charles. He was loving every second of it. The next few weeks were pure misery. I watched from my porch as Charles and his little inner circle strutted down the gated path with their shiny new keys. They fished, they swam, they even threw parties by the lake. Meanwhile, I was stuck on the sidelines, my own boat gathering dust. Neighbors whispered about me behind my back. He should have paid the fee. Everyone's got to follow the rules. Maybe he's just cheap. But they didn't know the truth. I wasn't going to roll over. Not for Charles. Not for anyone. One night, sitting on my porch with a glass of whiskey, I started digging into property records. It took hours, but I finally found it. That narrow strip of land leading to the lake, the very one with the fence. And gate didn't actually belong to the HOA. It belonged to a private owner. An old farmer who had inherited the land decades ago. The HOA had been leasing it for years, but the lease was about to expire. That's when the idea hit me. If I could buy that strip of land, then I wouldn't just get my lake access back. I'd own the only gate entrance to the lake, and the HOA. They'd have to play by my rules. I tracked down the farmer. A kind old man named Earl. He didn't care much for the HOA either. "They've been stiffing me on payments for years," he grumbled. I was thinking of just selling the land outright. My heart pounded. "How much are you asking?" Earl scratched his chin. I'd be happy with $30,000. Too much trouble dealing with those HOA folks. I didn't even blink. "You've got a deal." When the ink dried and the papers were signed, I felt a surge of power I'd never known before. That strip of land, the only entrance to the lake, was now mine. The HOA didn't know yet. Charles didn't know. But when he found out, it was going to be glorious. For the next week, I kept quiet. I walked by the fence casually, watching Charles laugh with his buddies, jingling his keys like some kind of king. And then, on a sunny Saturday morning, I made my move. I walked up to the gate while Charles was lounging by the water, sunglasses on, sipping a beer. He smirked when he saw me. "Sorry, friend. No access without a key." I smiled back. "Funny you should mention that." I reached into my pocket, pulled out a thick envelope, and handed it to him. Inside were the property deed papers. Charles's smirk disappeared as he flipped through them. His face turned pale. "What is this?" "It means," I said calmly, "you're standing on my property. This path, this gate, this entrance, you don't own it anymore." "I do." The silence was beautiful. His beer slipped from his hand and splashed onto the dock. And just like that, the tables had turned. But this was only the beginning. Because I didn't just want revenge. I wanted to teach the HOA and Charles in particular that when you mess with the wrong person, you might just lose everything. And trust me, they hadn't seen anything yet. Asterisk, asterisk, the first few days after I bought the strip were intoxicating. It wasn't just the power of ownership. It was the tiny, delicious nudges I could now give the whole neighborhood. A look here, a locked gate there, a raised eyebrow when Charles tried to swagger past. People started coming to me with questions. Some asked politely. Most didn't bother. "Hey, can I get through?" Mrs. Alvarez from 2 houses down asked, clutching a tote of dog toys like a supplicant. I smiled and handed her a temporary pass, a simple laminated card I'd printed that morning. 2 weeks. Enjoy. Others weren't so diplomatic. A pickup loaded with 3 of the HOA's board members pulled up one evening, tires crunching the gravel. Charles drove. He got out with that same practiced calm he used on every complaint he'd ever handled. "You can't be doing this," he said without preamble. "We have a long-term arrangement for that path. We pay for maintenance. We have rights. You have nothing but a lease," I said. "And your lease expired." I bought the land outright from Earl. He signed the deed. It's public record. Charles laughed, like he always did when someone tried to talk logic. "You know how this works. The HOA will file an injunction. We'll get a temporary restraining order. You'll have to open that gate." He lifted his chin like a man trying to show he was above the smallness of it all. It's the posture bullies use when they're about to threaten you with something they assume you can't handle. "Lawyers. File away," I said. 1. I'm prepared to defend my title. 2. I'd prefer we solve this like neighbors. We can arrange limited shared access if the HOA pays for a maintenance contract and a permit. That seems fair. Fair? He gave me a look that said I was amusing. "We paid Earl for years. You know that? You bought this to be petty." Maybe I did. Maybe a little. But being petty was not the same as being impulsive. I'd bought the land with a plan not just to lock people out, but to dismantle the facade of control the HOA had built. They left that night, slamming the gate so hard the latch rattled. I watched them drive off, for angry men shrinking behind tinted windows, and I smiled. The first rustle was always the loudest. Within 48 hours, the HOA's lawyers sent a letter. It was the type of letter written by people who dress in suits that are too expensive for the work they do. Formal, threatening, and stuffed with legalese. They claimed an easement by prescription. They argued the neighborhood had used that path openly, continuously, and notoriously for so long it had become their legal right. They wanted me to reopen the gate immediately. Easement by prescription is a real thing. In some cases, it exists. People can claim rights if they can show a long, uninterrupted history of use. But law is precise. It cares about dates, deeds, and records. And when you look carefully at those records, holes show up like moth-a-tan collars. I did exactly that. I spent nights at the county records office tracing deeds and title transfers. I found old surveys with plotted lines. I pulled up satellite images going back decades. I talked to older neighbors who remembered when Earl fenced his boundary more tightly in the 70s, and when the HOA started parking picnic tables near the water. There were plenty of stories, but not the unbroken chain of exclusive use the HOA lawyers hoped for. When their letter showed up, I had answers. I didn't email them a rant. I sent a single-page reply, professional and short, countering their claims with references and dates and an offer we could mediate. I proposed a compromise reasonable access rules for HOA members who paid a modest annual fee that would cover maintenance, insurance, and a public docking schedule. In exchange, I'd allow them 3 designated public access days each month. If they didn't like it, we'd go to court. If they smelled blood, they didn't show it. But that night, the neighborhood Facebook group exploded. People took sides like it was town square. Some praised me. Others called me every name they could think of that fit for someone who refused to roll over. That meant Charles was working his spin machine. Charles moved fast. He called an emergency board meeting 2 nights later and had it broadcast over the HOA's newsletter, a glossy thing they liked to use to remind people about trash, pickup schedules, and fines for overgrown lawns. The message was simple. The narrator, me, though they used my last name of course, had purchased private land and was threatening to disrupt the community's access to the lake. He framed it as a selfish, destabilizing act. He used words like dangerous precedent and community cohesion. He invited everyone to a special membership vote to authorize the board to pursue all legal remedies. I knew what this was. Public pressure. A show trial in a suburban auditorium. Charles wanted the crowd behind him when a judge looked at the case. He wanted whispers in the ears of those who mattered, the handful who would sign petitions, write op-eds, and maybe donate to a war chest. So I did something Charles didn't expect. I started inviting people. Politely and personally. One by one, my strategy wasn't to humiliate. It was to humanize. The HOA had turned civic organization into performance art. I turned it back into neighborly conversation. I walked 2 doors. I brought coffee for the early risers and cold lemonade for people who worked. I listened to fears the kids who loved to learn how to fish, the elderly man who had used the lake path since his wife's funeral, to family that considered the lake their backyard. Many were skeptical. Some were outright hostile. But a few were quietly furious at Thomas, at Charles, for how he'd handled things. For years they had grumbled about his heavy-handedness. The fines for garden gnomes, the suspiciously timed landscaping contracts awarded to his friends. Those grumbles are like tinder. I found allies where I didn't expect them. The HOA's own former treasurer, a woman named Jill, slipped me a note the day before the big meeting. "I can't speak at the meeting," she wrote, "but I'll vote with you if you promise not to make it all about me." She was small but fierce, the kind of person who paid attention to ledgers and smelled corruption when it was wrapped in glossy newsletters. On the day of the meeting, the auditorium filled. The air smelled like stale coffee and nerves. Charles arrived early, wearing a new blazer. He looked like a man primed for victory. He paced the stage and warmed up his talking points like a preacher before a sermon. When he spoke, used 2 main tools, repetition and spectacle. He repeated the words community and responsibility until they rang hollow. He put up a slideshow with photos of kids swimming, sunrises over the water, and, of course, the ominous fence. His voice rose like a tide. And people who'd come looking for clarity found themselves swept in. Then I spoke. I didn't shout. I didn't wave the deed like a flag. I told them a simple story. I said Earl had sold the land. One explained the legal situation, calmly and plainly. And I proposed the mediated plan again, safe, fair, and predictable access. I told them about the elderly man who used the lake for mourning. walks, and the single mother who needed a space for her kids to play. I said I wasn't trying to destroy the community. I was trying to make sure the rules were transparent and, frankly, honest. I finished by saying something I hadn't planned. We can either be a community that listens to every voice, including the inconvenient ones, or we can be a club that decides who belongs. If we choose the latter, we won't be a neighborhood anymore. We'll be a board. The room hummed. Some people cheered. Some frowned. Charles looked like someone who'd just been told he'd run out of script. When they voted that night, it wasn't a landslide. It wasn't even a clear majority. But it was enough. The membership rejected authorizing the board to pursue all legal remedies, without a membership vote for any extraordinary spending. In other words, Charles had to go back to the membership before spending thousands on a court battle. It was a small victory. But in wars of this sort, small victories are how empires crumble. You'd think Charles would retreat, lick his wounds, and reconsider. Instead, he shifted tactics. Legal threats didn't scare me, so he played the social game. He unleashed bylaws, interpretations, and whispers within a week. I found a notice on my door, a complaint filed against me for unauthorized commercial activity, namely, that I'd begun charging non-residents for access to the lake. He'd hired a few neighbors to scout and report any perceived infractions. Someone even claimed they'd seen a small sign near my gate advertising private docking, $20 per day. I hadn't put up any sign. But rumors are like paper boats. They float until the current sinks them. The complaint threatened fines. He sent the letter with the kind of smugness someone reserves for watching a slow-motion takedown. Instead of getting angry, I cleaned up a few details. I posted clear hours for the gate. I printed a laminated sign with private property, public access schedule, and a phone number for reservations. I made a modest, principled decision. Non-resident visitors could pay a small fee to help maintain the path, but residents would not be charged, ever. That gave me the moral high ground. Reasonable, honest, transparent. Charles turned red with fury when he saw the sign. "You can't be selective," he told a reporter from the local paper who'd shown up smelling a story. "This is private vendetta. This is profiteering from a community resource." I smiled for the camera. "No," I said. "This is ownership. This is accountability. If we want responsible maintenance, someone needs to ensure the work is done. If the HOA wants to manage it, fine. Put the offer on the table." The paper ran the story with a headline that made me laugh. "Local man locks lake, sparks community debate." The comments section read like a battlefield. My inbox filled with notes, some supportive, some venomous. But two things happened that week which changed the shape of the fight. First, some of Charles's cronies began to drop away. When push came to shove and signatures were needed at the bank, a few of the men who'd always followed him suddenly found reasons to be out of town. Money, it turned out, has a way of exposing loyalties. Second, an anonymous tip landed in my mailbox. It was a plain envelope with photocopies of invoices. Invoices showing that a landscaping contract the HOA had awarded for path maintenance had been billed at suspiciously high rates and paid to a shell company with ties through a network of LLCs to one of Charles's close associates. The handwriting on the envelope was simply, "Follow the money." That changed everything. A feud had become an investigation, so now we were past threats and into the territory. That makes people in small towns either fold or fight. I hired a paralegal I trusted, a sharp woman who knew how to request records and file discovery documents without appearing vindictive. Jill, the ex-treasurer, quietly helped where she could. She showed me ledger entries with notation styles only an accountant would love. There were gaps in payments that didn't add up. Charles tried to fight back in the court of public perception. He called emergency meetings, sent glossy pamphlets, and staged a board vote that claimed unanimous support for legal action. But each time he waived an invoice. I had two counters: facts and the uncanny ability to show those facts to people who still remembered. Earl's crooked fence and the way. Charles always smiled with a little too much certainty. This is when the subtle warfare began. Notices were filed, counters were filed. The county clerk's office began sending us both copies of requests for records. There were tense mornings walking past parked cars with people who used to nod and now stared. And then, one afternoon, my mailbox contained something I hadn't expected: an invitation. A lawyer, representing several homeowners, requested mediation. They wanted a neutral ground. They wanted to talk. I should have been elated. Instead, I felt a curious calm. This was exactly what I'd wanted: a stage with witnesses, facts, and an opportunity to expose the rot that had been hiding under well-trimmed hedges. As I walked to my car that evening, the gate clicking softly behind me, I realized something else. Winning a small battle doesn't make you a hero. It makes you a participant in a long, slow process. But for the first time since the fence went up, the momentum had shifted. People who had been too afraid to speak were now listening. The village had split, not into winners and losers, but into people who believed transparency mattered, and people who wanted the old club to continue passing notes behind closed doors. Don and Charles. He was no longer invincible. He was angry, sure, dangerous in his ways, but no longer unopposed. I locked my truck, breathed in the evening air, and walked back toward the gate. In the reflection of the metal, I could see a man who had bought a strip of land and found himself at the center of a story. It wasn't over. It was just getting interesting. You can always tell when someone's starting to lose control. They start to talk louder, faster, and with less sense. Charles was slipping into that stage now. The HOA had been used to absolute authority. They said jump. And the neighbors didn't ask how high, they just paid the fine if they didn't. But with the lake path, the spell had broken. Suddenly, rules weren't gospel. Suddenly, people were questioning where their money was really going. And Charles, he wasn't handling it well. The mediation request came from a group of homeowners, not the board. That was important. They wanted clarity. They wanted transparency. They wanted to know if the HOA had actually been spending their dues on maintenance, or if the rumors were truth that Charles and his buddies had been siphoning money through contracts. We set the meeting in a neutral place, the community center's smaller hall. I walked in early, carrying my folder of property deeds, invoices, and county documents. To be honest, I didn't expect much. I figured it'd be a shouting match, maybe a few angry neighbors demanding I tear down the fence. But when I got there, I realized this wasn't going to be ordinary. The room wasn't full of the usual HOA loyalists. It was filled with families, parents with notebooks, retired couples who'd lived there 20 years, even some younger renters who technically weren't members but had come anyway, curiosity burning in their eyes. And then Charles walked in. He didn't even try to hide his disdain. He carried a leather binder, slammed it on the table, and declared, "This meeting is unnecessary." The HOA board already voted unanimously to pursue legal action. This gathering is nothing but a distraction. He expected cheers. Instead, silence. One neighbor, Mr. Dalton, a retired Navy man with a deep voice that cut through nonsense, stood up. "Charles, we've been paying dues for years. And yet, every summer, we hear the same excuses. The dock needs repairs. The path needs landscaping. Insurance went up. But when we ask for receipts, all we get are summaries. Not itemized reports. Not real proof. Just numbers." He paused. looked right at me. This man, whether you like him or not, brought us copies of invoices the HOA has been paying, and those invoices don't add up. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Charles's face flushed red. Those are private records, he snapped. He had no right, but Dalton cut him off. They're not private. They're community records, paid with our money. And now we want answers. That's when I opened my folder. Calmly, I slid a stack of papers across the table toward the crowd. Every single one of these invoices, I said, is billed to a landscaping company called Green Shore Services. The HOA paid them over $40,000 in the last 3 years. But when I checked county business records, I flipped the page, showing the printout. Green Shore Services is nothing but a shell company. No employees. No equipment. Just a P.O. box registered to a holding company. And that holding company. I paused for effect. It's managed by Charles's brother-in-law. The silence that followed was delicious. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another said, "I knew it." Charles slammed the table. "This is slander," he barked. "Baseless lies." That data was obtained illegally, but the damage was done. Neighbors weren't staring at me anymore. They were staring at him. The invincible man, the gatekeeper of the community, suddenly looked small. Of course, Charles didn't go down quietly. Men like him never do. The very next morning, I found a notice taped to my front door. Violation unauthorized structure on HOA property. You are hereby fined $500 per day until the illegal fence is removed. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. My fence, on my land. Fined by his HOA, I took the notice down, folded it neatly, and stuck it in an envelope addressed to my lawyer. Let Charles dig his own grave. Every false claim he filed just made my case stronger. But while I was busy laughing, Charles was plotting something darker. A week later on a Sunday morning, I got a call from Jill, the ex-treasurer. Her voice shook. "They're coming for you," she whispered. "What do you mean?" I asked. I overheard Charles on the phone. "They're going to claim your gate is a safety hazard, that emergency vehicles can't get through. They're planning to push it with the fire marshal and the county. If the county declares your property a safety risk, they can force you to remove the fence." I pinched the bridge of my nose. Typical HOA play. When they couldn't win legally, they'd cry safety. "Thanks, Jill," I said quietly. "That gives me time to prepare." But even I wasn't ready for what happened next. That Tuesday night, just past midnight, I woke up to a noise. Metal clanging. Voices whispering. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the gate. And there they were, 3 men in hoodies, bolt cutters in hand, trying to slice through the lock. "Hey!" I barked. They froze. One dropped the cutters. Another cursed. They bolted down the path, disappearing into the dark before I could catch them. But they weren't fast enough, because I had installed a trail cam. The next morning, I pulled the footage. Clear as day, 3 men, faces caught in the glare. One of them unmistakably Charles's right-hand man on the board, Greg Mathers. I sat back, staring at the screen, a slow smile spreading across my face. Charles had just made his biggest mistake yet. See, locking me out of the lake was one thing. Finding me, another. But attempted trespass and vandalism, that was criminal. And now I had proof. The game wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. It was about the law. And the law? The law was finally on my side. End of part 3. We've escalated from community mediation to corruption exposure, with Charles striking back through sabotage and a major blunder caught on camera. In part 4, the stakes rise. The police get involved. Alliances shift. And Charles starts losing grip on the very board he controlled, Masome. Want me to push Part 4 into the police legal battle arc next, with Charles scrambling as the HOA fractures? Or should I slow burn it with more neighbor drama and small twists before law enforcement enters? You said continue into Part 4, ChatGPT said. Part 4. The law knocks back male narrator tone, measured. Amused but cutting, with a sense of mounting tension. Part 4 shifts into legal and police involvement while showing Charles's grip slipping. The morning after I caught them on camera, I brewed myself a strong cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and watched the footage again. 3 men, hoodies up, bolt cutters glinting in the moonlight. And the best part? When one of them turned toward the trail cam, his face was crystal clear. Greg Mathers, Charles's golden boy. The guy who once bragged about how the HOA ran smoother than a Swiss watch because of his spreadsheets. The same guy who fined a widow $300 because her mailbox paint wasn't the approved shade of autumn birch. I leaned back in my chair and let the satisfaction wash over me. Charles had made a mistake. A big one. By noon, I was sitting across from Officer Ramirez at the county sheriff's office. He was the kind of cop who'd seen it all, calm, skeptical, and never in a rush. He watched the footage twice, his thick eyebrows raising a little higher each time. Looks like attempted vandalism, he said finally. Trespassing too, considering it's on your property. Exactly, I said. And I want to press charges. Ramirez nodded slowly. We'll need statements. And I'll have to talk to these men first. You prepared for blowback? I smirked. That's the idea. Word spread faster than wildfire. By the end of the day, everyone in the neighborhood had heard the rumor. Charles's crew had been caught trying to break into my gate. Some neighbors pretended not to care. Others whispered about it at the coffee shop. And a few ones who had been staunch Charles supporters suddenly stopped showing up at board meetings. Loyalty has limits, and jail time tends to be one of them. The very next evening, Greg himself came knocking on my door. He looked pale, sweaty, a man who'd spent the day realizing his invincible HOA wasn't so invincible anymore. Listen, he said quickly, last night was a misunderstanding. We weren't trying to damage anything. We thought maybe the gate was stuck and with bolt cutters. I interrupted. He swallowed hard. Look, I don't want this to get ugly. Drop the complaint and I'll make sure the board backs off. We can work something out. I folded my arms. Funny, that's the same line Charles gave me when this all started. Except back then, I didn't have video proof of a crime. Greg's jaw clenched. So that's how it's gonna be. That's how it's gonna be. He stormed off, muttering curses under his breath. But I didn't care. The harder they pushed, the deeper they dug themselves into the hole. Meanwhile, Charles was scrambling. He tried to spin the story, of course. At the next board meeting, he stood at the front like a preacher at Sunday service, waving his arms and declaring, "These accusations are nothing more than an attempt to smear the integrity of your HOA leadership." But this time, the crowd wasn't nodding along. They were whispering, pointing, shooting skeptical looks. Because by then, copies of the invoices I'd uncovered had started circulating. Neighbors who never cared about budgets suddenly cared a lot about where their money had gone. And when you pair that with the rumor of his board members breaking into private property, Charles wasn't preaching to believers anymore. He was preaching to doubters. 2 days later, Officer Ramirez paid Charles a visit. Now, I wasn't there, but I heard about it from 3 different neighbors who were. Ramirez showed up at Charles's house mid-afternoon, uniform crisp, cruiser parked in plain view. The whole street saw it. He asked questions. He took notes. He left with a copy of the video on a USB drive. And just like that, Charles's aura of control cracked a little more. But Charles wasn't the type to quit. No, he doubled down. The next morning, I found another notice taped to my door. This one was laughable. Violation, unapproved surveillance equipment. The trail camera installed near the gate is in violation of HOA guidelines. Daily fines will accrue until removed. I actually laughed out loud. He was fining me for the very camera that caught his own board member committing a crime. I didn't even bother responding this time. I just sent a copy of the notice to my lawyer with a sticky note. Frame this one. It's comedy gold. Meanwhile, alliances were shifting. Remember Jill, the ex-treasurer? She wasn't the only one slipping me information. A younger board member named Yvonne Fresh, out of college, idealistic, and tired of Charles's bullying, pulled me aside after one meeting. He's panicking, Evan whispered. Half the board wants to distance themselves. They're sick of being dragged into this mess. But Charles, he won't let go. He keeps threatening us. Says if anyone defects, he'll dig up violations and bury us in fines. I grinned. Sounds like blackmail to me. Evan hesitated. Would you? Would you testify to what you found? If this goes to court. Gladly, I said. And that's when I realized something. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about the entire HOA, the neighbors, the dues, the power structure Charles had built brick by brick. If I played this right, I wouldn't just win my lake access. I could end Charles's reign for good. The real twist came a week later. I was pulling weeds in my yard when Jill hurried over, clutching a folder. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder like someone in a spy movie. Take this, she whispered, handing me the folder. Inside were copies of bank statements. Real ones, not summaries, not sanitized spreadsheets, and right there, in black and white, were large payments being funneled to a company linked directly to Charles himself. Not just his brother-in-law, Charles, it was fraud. Plain and simple. Jill's voice was shaking. I can't hold this anymore. They'll come after me if they find out I gave it to you. But the homeowners deserve to know. I nodded, closing the folder. Don't worry. This is the nail in the coffin. And as I looked down at those papers, one thought burned in my mind. Charles had started this war with a fence. But I was going to finish it by tearing down his entire empire. Asterisk, when I first bought my land. I thought the HOA was just a nuisance. Annoying fines, endless rules, board members who loved their clipboards a little too much. But standing there with Jill's folder in my hands, I realized this wasn't a nuisance anymore. This was a scandal. And Charles was at the center of it. I didn't waste time. My lawyer, Ms. Daniels, had a reputation for ripping through HOA corruption like a buzzsaw. She reviewed the statements, cross-referenced the accounts, and within 48 hours, she had drafted a demand letter to the HOA board. It was short, brutal, and impossible to ignore. Cease all fines, reimburse homeowners for misused funds, and remove Charles from his position or face civil and criminal proceedings. We sent it certified mail to every board member and homeowner. No more whispers. No more secrecy. And just like that, the HOA was a battlefield. The very next evening, the community center was packed. I had never seen so many homeowners show up at a meeting. People who hadn't cared for years were suddenly sitting forward in their chairs, waving copies of the demand letter, asking questions Charles had no good answers for. He stood at the front of the room, sweating through his shirt, insisting it was all fake documents and misunderstandings. But his voice cracked. He kept glancing at Greg, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. One woman shouted from the back, "If it's all fake, then why was the sheriff at your house last week?" The room erupted. Shouts, demands, fingers pointing. Charles tried banging his gavel like a judge, yelling, "Order! Order!" But this wasn't a courtroom. It was a mutiny. Then Jill stood up, calm, collected. She cleared her throat and spoke in a voice that cut through the noise. "I was treasurer," she said. "I saw the books. I watched Charles funnel our money into his own company. I stepped down because I couldn't be part of it anymore." The room went silent. For a second, Charles just stood there, jaw tight, eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Then he did the one thing no one expected. He snapped. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted. "You all loved your manicured lawns and fancy streetlights while I made this place worth living in. Without me, this neighborhood is nothing." His voice cracked into a full-blown scream. Spit flew from his mouth. His face turned red as he jabbed a finger at the crowd. "You're all parasites. Every one of you." That was it. That was the moment the mask slipped. Neighbors started booing. Some walked out. Others shouted for his resignation. Evan, the young board member, raised his hand and said loudly, "I motion to remove Charles as president of the HOA. Another voice shouted, "I second it." The gavel Charles had been slamming so proudly was now shaking in his hand. He tried to shout them down, but the chants grew louder. "Resign. Resign. Resign." By the time the meeting ended, Charles hadn't resigned. Not yet. But the board had voted to suspend him pending investigation. Evan was appointed acting president. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt the tide turning for good. But Charles wasn't done. Oh no. 2 days later, I came home to find a letter taped to my gate. Not a fine this time. Something worse. Notice of legal action. The HOA intends to sue for defamation, harassment, and damages resulting from unauthorized release of confidential information. Charles had lawyered up. It was a desperate move, a Hail Mary pass with no receiver in sight. But it meant one thing. He wasn't going down quietly. I called Ms. Daniels immediately. She actually laughed when she read the notice. "Defamation," she said. "Charles should Google the word before he uses it. Truth is the best defense and we've got. The truth in spades." She leaned forward across her desk, her eyes gleaming. "Miss this isn't just about keeping your gate. This is about burying Charles so deep. No HOA in this state would dare try this again." And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just a personal victory anymore. This was going to be a public execution. End of Part 5. The HOA collapses from within. Charles is suspended but lashes out with a desperate lawsuit. Part 6 will escalate into courtroom battles, public humiliation, and Charles's final downfall. Do you want me to make Part 6 a courtroom showdown arc, legal drama, evidence presented? HOA fully stripped bare, or more of a street-level chaos arc, neighbors rebelling? Charles caught trying one last dirty trick before the court. You said, continue into Part 6, ChatGPT said. Part 6, courtroom crossfire male narrator tone. Steady, sharp, and confident, weaving tension like a courtroom. Drama while still keeping that personal edge of revenge and satisfaction. Charles thought he could scare me with a lawsuit. He thought the words legal action printed in bold would make me fold, make me panic. But here's the thing about people like Charles. They always underestimate the quiet ones. I didn't panic. I prepared. The day of the hearing, the county courthouse was buzzing. It wasn't just me, Charles, and our lawyers. Neighbors had shown up, lots of them. Some out of curiosity, some out of loyalty, and a whole lot just to see Charles finally squirm under oath. I walked in with Ms. Daniels at my side, calm and collected. Charles stormed in 5 minutes later, dragging his attorney behind him, jaw set like he was walking into battle. He still had that air of arrogance, but the sweat on his collar gave him away. We sat across from each other, the judge eyeing us both like two kids about to fight on the playground. Mr. Charles Harper, the judge began, Your claim is defamation. Explain. Charles stood, puffing his chest. Yes, Your Honor. This man, he jabbed a finger at me, has spread false and malicious lies about me, damaging my reputation and disrupting the stability of our community. The judge raised an eyebrow. And what lies, specifically? Charles hesitated. He accused me of mismanaging funds, of creating shell companies, of stealing from my neighbors. The judge nodded. And can you prove that these accusations are false? Charles's lawyer shuffled his papers nervously. Then it was Ms. Daniels' turn. She didn't raise her voice, didn't waste a word. She simply stood, walked to the evidence table, and laid down Jill's folder like a royal flush in a poker game. Your Honor, she said, what my client revealed is not defamation. It is documented truth. Here are copies of financial records, business registrations, and invoices. They clearly show HOA funds funneled into a company owned by Mr. Harper's brother-in-law. Additionally, she pulled out another document. We have a sworn statement from the former treasurer confirming Mr. Harper's direct involvement. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He flipped through the papers slowly, his expression hardening with every page. Charles fidgeted. His lawyer whispered frantically in his ear. And then Ms. Daniels delivered the knockout punch. We also have video evidence, Your Honor. She clicked a button. On the courtroom screen appeared the trail cam footage Greg, Charles's loyal bulldog, caught red-handed at my gate with bolt cutters. The entire courtroom gasped. Charles's face went pale. The judge set the papers down, steepling his fingers. Mr. Harper, he said slowly, you came into my courtroom claiming to be defamed. But what I see here is credible evidence of fraud, misappropriation of funds, and possible criminal trespass. Are you certain you want to pursue this lawsuit? Charles stammered. This is out of context. The judge cut him off. Careful, Mr. Harper, because if I find you knowingly filed a frivolous lawsuit, I can sanction you personally. You could have heard a pin drop in the end. The judge dismissed Charles's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning he couldn't refile it. Not only that, he ordered Charles to pay my legal fees. The room exploded in whispers. Some neighbors smirked. Others shook their heads in disbelief. As I walked out, I caught Charles's eye one last time. His face was a cocktail of rage, humiliation, and fear. For the first time since this war began, he wasn't in control. He was cornered, and something told me he wasn't done lashing out. That night, I sat on my porch, looking at the lake, glistening under the moonlight. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. But deep down, I knew Charles wasn't the type to surrender. Men like him don't just fade away. They scheme. They plot. They wait for the next chance to strike. And as much as I wanted to believe the fight was over, something told me the worst was still coming. Winning in court should have been the end of it. The judge dismissed Charles's case. He was ordered to pay my legal fees. And his credibility was shattered in front of the entire community. But if there's one thing I learned, it's this: corner a rat, and it doesn't lie down. It bites. The first sign came the very next week. A group of neighbors knocked on my door, 2 families who had voted for Charles in the past. They looked uneasy. One of them, Mr. Lee, cleared his throat and said, Charles has been coming around at night, knocking on doors, telling people the judge was biased, that you bribed someone. Almost laughed until Mr. Lee added, he said if we don't back him, he'll raise our dues through the roof once he's reinstated. Threats. Pure intimidation. That's when I realized Charles wasn't just desperate, he was dangerous. The second sign was worse. I came home late one evening to find my gate lock smashed again. This time, they hadn't bothered with bolt cutters. Someone had doused the lock with acid. leaving it corroded and useless. They hadn't even tried to be subtle. On the fence was spray painted in red, "Traitor." I stood there in the dark, my stomach twisting. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. This was personal. The third sign was almost laughable. It wasn't so pathetic. The HOA newsletter showed up in my mailbox, typed up like always, but with a bold headline across the front. Warning: Lake access closed for public safety. The article underneath, clearly written by Charles, claimed that my gate was structurally unsafe, that children could be injured, and that residents should avoid the lake until further notice. The kicker? At the bottom of the page was Charles's signature. Even suspended, even disgraced. He was still trying to issue commands like a king who'd lost his crown. But here's where it all started to unravel for him. Neighbors weren't buying it anymore. Mrs. Green, the retired teacher, stopped me at the mailbox one morning and said, "I've lived here 20 years. I believed every word Charles said. Until now. He's lost his mind, hasn't he?" I didn't have to answer. She already knew. More and more people were turning against him. They started holding their own meetings without him. Some even formed a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. And Charles? He was spiraling. The breaking point came one stormy Friday night. Lightning lit up the sky as I sat by the window, sipping coffee, trying to enjoy the rare peace. But then I saw headlights creeping toward the gate. A truck. Charles's truck. He stepped out, who'd pulled over his head. Something heavy in his hands. At first, I thought it was another set of cutters. But as the lightning flashed again, I saw it clearly. It was a gas can. My heart dropped. He wasn't just trying to break the gate this time. He was trying to burn it. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands, then sprinted to the porch. "Charles," I shouted over the storm. "What the hell are you doing?" T froze. For a moment, he looked like a man caught in the middle of a nightmare. His face twisted, half rage, half despair. "You ruined me," he screamed, voice cracking. "You turned them all against me. That lake was mean. I built this community. And you stole it." I took a step closer. Careful, steady. "Put it down, Charles. You're finished. Don't make it worse." For a second, I thought he might listen. But then his hands shook, the gas can tipped, and the sharp smell of gasoline filled the air. That's when red and blue lights flashed. Across the trees, the sheriff's car skidded up behind him, tires splashing through mud. Officers jumped out, shouting commands. "Drop IT." Now, Charles dropped the can. Slowly, he raised his hands, rain pouring down his face like tears. And just like that, the king of the HOA was led away in handcuffs. The neighborhood was silent the next morning. No one mowed their lawn. No one walked their dog. It was like everyone was holding their breath, realizing they'd witnessed the fall of a tyrant. And me. I stood at my gate, hands in my pockets, staring out at the lake. For the first time since this war began, it felt like mine. But deep down, I wondered, was Charles gone for good? Or had I just witnessed the first act of something even darker? Asterisk: when Charles was hauled off in cuffs, you'd think the neighborhood would have celebrated. Balloons, champagne, a banner that read "Good riddance." But that's not how it happened. The morning after his arrest, the community felt heavy, quiet, like everyone was waiting for someone else to say the first word. Because even though Charles was gone, his shadow still lingered. The HOA board scrambled to meet. Without Charles, without Greg, they were leaderless. Evan, the acting president, tried to keep order. But it was like watching a kid hold the wheel of a runaway car. Neighbors were restless. Some argued the HOA could be salvaged if they just cleaned house. Others, louder voices, said, "Burn it all down. I've paid fines for 10 years for grass being 2 inches too high. One man shouted, "Dissolve the HOA. We don't need it." A retired couple chimed in. "We moved here for peace and quiet, not dictators. Tear it apart." The room buzzed with anger, years of frustration boiling over, and I sat in the back, arms crossed, watching. This was bigger than me now. The lake, the gate, the fine sows were just sparks. The fire had spread. The whole neighborhood was ready to rise up, but not everyone was ready to let go. A small group, the old guard. Charles's loyalists clung to the idea of order. They muttered about property values, about lawsuits, about anarchy if the HOA dissolved. One of them, Mrs. Patterson, glared right at me. "This is all your fault. You didn't just take down Charles, you destroyed our community." I didn't respond. She wasn't entirely wrong. I hadn't destroyed the community. I'd exposed what was already broken. The turning point came 2 weeks later. A petition circulated quietly at first, then like wildfire. It was simple. Shall the HOA be dissolved? All it needed was a majority vote from homeowners. People signed in droves. Parents, retirees, even those who had once backed Charles. By the end of the week, the petition had enough signatures to force a special vote. And when the night of the vote came, the turnout was massive. The community center was standing room only. Evan tried to keep order, reading the proposal into the record. Then the ballots were passed around. Each homeowner marked yes or no. You could hear a pin drop as the votes were counted. Finally, Evan looked up, his voice steady. By a margin of 72-19. The HOA is officially dissolved. The room erupted. Cheers, clapping, even tears from some. It was over. The reign of Charles and his little empire was done. The next morning, the HOA office sign was taken down from the community center. The files, the records, the rules all boxed up. Sent off to be archived. The neighborhood felt lighter, freer, for the first time. People waved at each other, not because they feared a fine, but because they were actually neighbors, and me. I stood in my gate, keys in hand, and smiled. Because now, the lake wasn't just mine by law. It was mine in spirit. No one could take it away again. But just as I allowed myself to breathe, just as I thought the storm had passed, an envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address. Just my name. Inside a single sheet of paper. This isn't over. No signature. No clue who sent it, but in my gut, I already knew. Charles might be gone from the board. He might even be facing charges. But a man like him, he doesn't fade quietly. And something told me. His fight wasn't finished yet. When the HOA dissolved, life should have gone back to normal. No more fines for paint colors. No more board meetings packed with shouting matches. No more Charles breathing down everyone's neck. And for a while, it did feel normal. Peaceful even. Neighbors planted what they wanted in their yards. Kids rode bikes without helmets, and no one came storming over with a clipboard. The lake became a gathering place again. Families picnicked by the water. Teenagers fished off the dock. It felt like we'd taken back something that had been stolen from us, but the envelope in my mailbox said otherwise. At first, I tried to brush it off. A prank, maybe? Or one of Charles's loyalists. Still bitter about losing their little fiefdom, but then strange things started happening. One night, I came home late and found muddy footprints near my gate. The prints weren't mine. They weren't fresh enough to follow, but they hadn't been there that morning. Another time. I heard a knock at my door around midnight. When I opened it, no one was there. Just silence and the faint sound of an engine starting in the distance. And then came the letters. Not just one. 3 more. Each slipped into my mailbox without a stamp. Each with the same message, scrawled in jagged handwriting. This isn't over. I told myself Charles couldn't have done it. He was facing charges, waiting on trial for attempted arson and fraud. The sheriff had made that clear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he or someone working for him was still pulling strings. I started checking the locks twice at night. Installed more cameras. Even Jill, tough as she was, admitted she felt uneasy walking home after dark. The neighborhood had won its freedom. But we were living with ghosts. Then one evening, Evan came by. He looked tired older, like the whole ordeal had aged him 10 years. "I've been hearing things," he said quietly. "Charles has friends in county offices. He's trying to delay the charges, maybe even get them dropped. If he pulls it off, he could come back." I stared at him. Come back? As what? "There's no HOA anymore." Evan nodded slowly. "True, but a man like Charles doesn't need an HOA. He just needs control. And if he can't get it through the board, he'll find another way." The words stuck with me, another way. And sure enough, a week later, I found out what he meant. A real estate company had started sniffing around. They were making offers quietly off the books to homeowners struggling with their mortgages. Cash deals. Quick closings, the company's name. Greenshore Holdings, the same name that had appeared on those shell company invoices. Charles wasn't just trying to win back power. He was trying to buy the neighborhood. That night, as I stood by the lake with the wind rippling across the water, I realized something chilling. The HOA was gone. Charles was disgraced. But the war wasn't over. He had lost the battle for control. Now, he was trying to win the war for ownership. And if I didn't stop him, the lake, the land, and the freedom we'd fought for could slip right back into his hands. Asterisk, I always thought the HOA fight was the end of it. I was wrong. Charles wasn't just a bully with a clipboard. He was a strategist. The HOA had been his first weapon. Real estate was his second. If he could buy out enough properties, he'd own the neighborhood in everything but name. And this time, there wouldn't be elections or bylaws to stop him. He wasn't trying to control us with rules anymore. He was trying to own us outright. I couldn't let that happen, so I dug. I pulled every string I had, left county records, shell company filings, even old emails I'd archived during the HOA war. And slowly, the picture came into focus. Charles wasn't doing this alone. He had partners, investors, people with deep pockets and even deeper connections. But he'd made one mistake. In his arrogance, he'd left a paper trail of fake invoices overlapping LLCs and contracts that tied Greenshore Holdings back to his personal accounts. It was enough. Enough to blow everything open. If I played it right, I called Jill and Evan to my place. Spread the files across the kitchen table. "This isn't just about Charles anymore," I said. "He's got backing. If we go public, we have to hit hard. No rumors, no half-truths. We need proof." Jill leaned forward, eyes narrowing on the papers. "So we give the proof to the sheriff." I shook my head. Not just the sheriff. The press. State regulators. Hell, the Attorney General's office if we have to. Charles wants a war of shadows, so we drag him into the light. The next week was chaos. Phone calls, meetings, sleepless nights. Spent triple-checking documents, and then came the day of reckoning. A local news crew ran the story first. Former HOA president tied to real estate scheme targeting neighborhood residents. Within hours, it spread. Regional outlets picked it up. Then statewide by the next morning. Charles was back in the spotlight, but not the way he wanted. The fallout was brutal. Greenshore Holdings collapsed overnight. The investors scrambled to distance themselves. And Charles. He was arrested again, this time on fraud and racketeering charges. Neighbors who once feared him watched as deputies, escorted him out in handcuffs again. Only this time, there was no chance of a comeback. The lake was ours. The homes were safe. And Charles was finished. That night, I stood by the water, listening to the frogs sing in the reeds. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter. No fines, no threats. No letters in my mailbox telling me what I couldn't do on my own land. We had fought a war, neighbors, against corruption, against control, against a man who thought he could own us, and we had one. But as I turned to head home, I saw something across the lake. A single light flickered on in Charles's old house, empty for weeks, supposedly locked tight. For a moment, I froze, watching, waiting. Then the light went dark, and the night swallowed it whole. Asterisk, asterisk, that's all for today, folks. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.